The bus doors swung open with a hiss, letting in the humid afternoon air as a man in a neatly pressed uniform stepped onto the first step. His posture was upright, his stride steady. A man who had spent years serving his country with pride. James Carter, a black veteran, had seen things most people couldn't imagine. He had faced the horrors of war, endured long nights in trenches, and fought side by side with men of all backgrounds. But nothing could have prepared him for the quiet humiliation waiting for him on this bus ride home. The driver, a middle-aged man with a sharp gaze and a worn-out cap, barely looked at James as he jerked his thumb toward the back. "Seats up front ain't for you," he muttered, his voice low but firm. James hesitated for a second, gripping the strap of his duffel bag tighter. He had just come back from serving his country, a country that claimed freedom and equality for all. And yet, here he was, being told, no, ordered, to take his place at the back, as if his sacrifice meant nothing. A few passengers turned their heads, watching in silence. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending not to notice. Others, the ones who had seen this too many times, simply stared ahead, as if it was just another ordinary day. But for James, it was anything but ordinary. His blood simmered beneath his skin, but he knew better than to cause a scene. He had fought battles before, and some fights required patience rather than force. With a slow nod, he stepped past the rows of seats, walking toward the back of the bus, feeling every pair of eyes on him. The bus jolted forward, rattling along the road, but an uneasy tension hung in the air. James stared out the window, his reflection looking back at him. Strong, composed, but carrying a weight heavier than his duffel bag. He had seen justice fail too many times, but he also knew something else. Life had a way of balancing the scales, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. And as the minutes ticked by, something was about to happen. Something that would remind everyone, including that bus driver, that karma had its own schedule. James sat in silence, his fingers resting on the strap of his bag as the bus rumbled forward. He had learned long ago how to keep his emotions in check, but that didn't mean he didn't feel them. The sting of injustice, the weight of exhaustion, it was all there, buried beneath years of discipline. He had fought for this country, yet the fight never seemed to end. A few rows ahead, a young woman glanced back at him, her eyes filled with something close to sympathy. But she said nothing, just like the others. James didn't blame them. Speaking up had its consequences. He had seen it happen before. People losing jobs, facing threats, all because they dared to challenge the way things were. That was the world he had returned to, the same world he had left behind when he boarded that military plane years ago. The driver kept his eyes on the road, but his posture carried an air of quiet arrogance. He had done this before, James could tell. It wasn't a slip of the tongue or an accident. It was a belief, a routine, and he expected James to accept it without question. The bus jerked to a stop at the next corner, and an older man stepped on, his cane tapping against the metal steps. He looked around for a seat, but the front ones were already taken. He turned toward the back, his gaze landing on James for a brief moment before shuffling down the aisle. The air was thick with an unspoken understanding. James exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening for a second before he forced them to relax. He had been in worse situations. He had been stranded in enemy territory, forced to make decisions that haunted him in the dead of night. Compared to that, sitting at the back of a bus should have been easy. But it wasn't. Another stop, more passengers. The bus was starting to fill up now, the quiet hum of conversation mixing with the steady drone of the engine. The driver barely spared anyone a glance, until a man in a crisp suit stepped on. Something about him made the driver stiffen just slightly, but it was enough for James to notice. The man didn't move right away. He stood near the front, scanning the rows, his eyes sharp and observant. Then, without a word, he turned his gaze to the driver. And in that moment, James knew something was about to shift. The man in the suit took a slow step forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the worn floor of the bus. His presence alone carried an authority that made people take notice. He wasn't rushed, wasn't flustered, just calm, steady, and aware of everything happening around him. The driver cleared his throat, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. "You gonna sit down or what?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral, but there was a slight edge to it. The man tilted his head, considering the question. Then his eyes flickered to James at the back. There was no pity in his gaze, no exaggerated display of sympathy, just quiet understanding. The kind that didn't need words. "I'll stand," the man finally said, gripping the overhead rail. The driver let out a sharp breath through his nose, clearly irritated, but he didn't push the issue. The bus jolted forward again, rolling through the streets, but the air inside was charged now, like a storm waiting to break. James watched the man from his seat, curiosity stirring beneath his frustration. He didn't know him, but there was something deliberate about the way he moved, the way he had taken in the scene without reacting too quickly. As the ride continued, a few quiet conversations picked up among the passengers, but there was a tension beneath it all. Even those who had chosen to stay silent earlier could feel that something was shifting. The old man with the cane sat quietly a few seats ahead, his hands resting over the top handle, but his gaze kept darting toward the front of the bus. The young woman who had glanced at James before was now gripping the edge of her seat, as if bracing for something she couldn't quite name. Then, just as the bus slowed for another stop, a deep voice spoke. "You a military man?" James looked up. It was the man in the suit. James hesitated for a moment, then gave a short nod. "Yeah." The man's expression didn't change, but something in his stance softened just a little. "Thought so," he said. Then, turning slightly toward the driver, he added, "Funny thing about veterans. They fight for everyone, even the ones who don't deserve it." The words hung heavy in the air. The driver's shoulders tensed, his knuckles whitening against the wheel. He didn't turn around, but James could see the muscles in his jaw tightening. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. The bus doors opened, letting in a gust of warm air and another passenger. But for the first time since James stepped onto that bus, he wasn't just another invisible man being pushed to the back. Something had shifted, even if only slightly. And he had a feeling this ride was far from over. The bus rolled forward, but the tension inside had taken on a life of its own. The hum of conversation had quieted, replaced by an uneasy stillness. James could feel it. Everyone could. The man in the suit hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a scene, but his words still echoed in the stale air. The driver's grip on the wheel was tighter now, his shoulders stiff, his gaze locked on the road as if ignoring the moment would make it disappear. James shifted slightly, his back straightening. He had been through worse situations, but something about this felt different. This wasn't a battlefield, and yet it felt like a standoff. The kind where one wrong move could change everything. A sharp turn sent a jolt through the bus, making a few passengers grab their seats for balance. James barely moved, but he noticed the driver's movements had become rougher, his foot a little heavier on the gas. Frustration, anger, whatever it was simmering just beneath the surface, waiting to boil over. Then, without warning, the driver spoke. "You got a problem." His voice was low, clipped, but it carried through the bus like a blade cutting through silence. The man in the suit didn't flinch. He kept his hand on the rail, his posture relaxed but firm. "No problem at all," he replied smoothly, "just an observation." The driver let out a short, bitter laugh. "Yeah. Well, keep your observations to yourself." A few people shifted in their seats. The young woman near the middle of the bus glanced toward James again, her fingers curling around the strap of her bag. The older man with the cane exhaled slowly, staring at his lap like he was preparing himself for whatever was coming next. James didn't move, but his pulse had picked up slightly. He could see where this was going, and so could everyone else. The driver had been in control from the moment James stepped onto this bus. He had expected compliance, expected everyone to accept the unspoken rules. But now that control was slipping, and he knew it. The bus came to another stop, the doors creaking open. A few passengers got off quickly, sensing the storm brewing inside. The ones who stayed behind exchanged cautious glances, unsure of what would happen next. The driver let out a sharp breath and turned his head just slightly, his eyes flickering toward the man in the suit. "You think you're real smart, don't you?" The man smiled, but there was no amusement in it. "No, just paying attention." The driver's jaw clenched. For a moment, he seemed to consider his next words carefully. Then, as if making a decision, he pulled the lever and slammed the doors shut. James felt the shift immediately. The way the air grew heavier, the way the driver's fingers twitched against the wheel. The bus wasn't just moving forward anymore. It was heading straight towards something inevitable. And whatever was coming next, there was no turning back now. The bus lurched forward, faster this time. The driver's foot was heavy on the pedal, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. The air inside was thick with unspoken tension, every passenger feeling the shift, but not daring to acknowledge it out loud. James kept his gaze steady, watching the way the driver's fingers twitched against the steering wheel. He had seen men like this before, men who felt their power slipping and scrambled to take it back, no matter the cost. The man in the suit still hadn't taken a seat. He stood firm, gripping the overhead rail, his face calm but unreadable. Whatever he was waiting for, James had a feeling it was coming soon. Then something unexpected happened. The bus turned sharply onto a side street, one that wasn't part of the usual route. A few passengers sat up straighter, glancing at each other in confusion. The young woman near the middle of the bus looked out the window, her brows furrowing. The older man with the cane shifted uneasily. Even James felt his stomach tighten. The driver's eyes flicked to the mirror, scanning the faces behind him. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "This ain't your usual ride home, is it?" he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for James and the man in the suit to hear. James didn't respond. He just watched. Observed. The man in the suit, however, let out a slow exhale, as if he had been expecting this. "You really want to do this?" the man asked, his voice low and measured. The driver let out a short, dry laugh. "Do what?" he shot back, gripping the wheel tighter. "I'm just doing my job. Taking a detour." James had been in enough situations to know when something wasn't right. This wasn't just about a bus ride anymore. It was about control, about sending a message. The young woman near the middle of the bus turned fully now, her voice hesitant. "Why are we going this way?" she asked. The driver ignored her, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The bus picked up speed, rolling past unfamiliar streets, past buildings that weren't part of the usual route. James clenched his jaw. He had seen this kind of power play before, but what the driver didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that some fights had already been decided long before they even began. And this was one of them. The bus sped down the unfamiliar road, its tires humming against the pavement as the uneasy silence stretched between the passengers. James could feel the tension rising, thick as the summer air pressing against the windows. The young woman clutched her bag tighter, her breaths shallow. The older man with the cane kept his eyes forward, his fingers tightening over the handle as if bracing himself. The driver's smirk hadn't faded. He was enjoying this, the way he held control of the bus over them. He thought he was making a statement, proving a point. But what he didn't realize was that he had already lost. Then the man in the suit finally moved. He reached into his jacket, not in a rush, not as a threat, but with a calculated precision. The driver must have caught it in the mirror because, for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "Pull over," the man said, his voice quiet but firm. The driver scoffed. "Or what?" The man held up a badge, a gleaming, unmistakable symbol of authority. "Federal investigator," he said, his voice still calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "And right now, you're in a whole lot more trouble than you realize." The bus jerked slightly as the driver's foot eased off the gas. The smirk was gone now, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic. James sat back slightly, watching the moment unfold. He hadn't expected this. The man in the suit had been careful, waiting for just the right time. And now the power had shifted completely. The young woman let out a quiet gasp. A few passengers exchanged stunned glances. The older man with the cane nodded slightly, as if confirming something he had suspected all along. "You took this bus off route," the agent continued, his voice never wavering. "Endangering passengers, abusing your position, and that's just the start." The driver's hands flexed on the wheel. He was stuck, nowhere to go, no excuses left to make. The weight of the moment settled over him like a storm cloud. Then, in one final act of defiance, he let out a bitter laugh. "You really think you can do something about it?" The agent tilted his head, his gaze steady. "I don't think," he said. "I know." And then, just as the bus rolled to a stop, flashing red and blue lights appeared in the distance, sirens cutting through the air. James exhaled slowly. The fight was over before it had even begun. The flashing lights grew brighter, the distant wail of sirens now sharp and clear. The bus slowed to a complete stop, the hum of the engine the only sound in the tense silence. James watched as the driver's grip on the wheel slackened, his shoulders sinking as reality caught up with him. The arrogance, the smirk, gone. In its place was the look of a man who knew he had lost. A moment later, the doors hissed open, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Their eyes scanned the bus before landing on the driver. "Step out," one of them ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. For a second, the driver hesitated, his pride still fighting against the inevitable. But there was no way out. He let out a long breath, then slowly stood, stepping away from the wheel. As he walked past the passengers, he didn't look at any of them. No parting words, no last attempt to assert control, just silence. James felt a shift, not just in the bus, but in the air itself. The tension that had held everyone captive was finally breaking apart, piece by piece. The young woman let out a shaky exhale, loosening her grip on her back. The older man with the cane gave a slow nod, as if acknowledging something much bigger than just what had happened today. The agent in the suit stepped forward, speaking briefly with the officers before turning back to face the bus. "You're all free to go," he said simply, his eyes landing on James for just a second longer than the others. It wasn't pity, it wasn't regret, just recognition. James met his gaze and gave a small nod, one soldier to another. No words were needed. As the passengers filed off the bus, James took one last look around. The same seats, the same windows, the same old route, but something felt different. Maybe not for the world as a whole, but for this moment, in this place, change had happened. Stepping onto the pavement, he inhaled deeply, the warm air filling his lungs. Then, with the steady stride of a man who had already fought too many battles, he slung his duffel bag over his shoulder and walked away.